We'll look at the opportunities and challenges that exist at the intersection of technology and trade. Please welcome Bhupen Wakankar, Director Global Trade for Amazon India; Anita Prakash, Senior Policy Advisor for International Economic Cooperation, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia; Christoph Kiener, EU Chief Negotiator for Trade. Instead of Mr. Kumar Iyer from FCDO, who will not be able to make it, we have Sarah Fellon, Regional Director, India and Middle East Science and Innovation Network at the British High Commission. And moderating the discussion would be Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. It is always a challenge to be the panel right after lunch. And team, we have two additional challenges. One is our charge is to discuss technology and trade, a very broad topic that we can take in a lot of different directions. And then second, by this clock, I see that we have 33 minutes and 4 panelists to cover this very large topic. So I am going to moderate this panel very, very lightly so you can hear from our fabulous experts and specialists on the panel. I hope we can not just admire the problem, but try to be problem solving. Just by way of very, very brief introduction, I just want to flag 3 themes because I don't know if you were all here yesterday, but they recurred again and again yesterday. And they're relevant, I think, to this topic of technology and trade. The first is the theme of fragmentation. The world is fragmented, and it's fragmented first on the basis of agreements, but second on the basis of ideas about how the trading system ought to function. Agreements, because if you just take this region, for instance, there are 3 agreements: the CPTPP, the RCEP, the DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. My own country, the United States, is outside of not 1, not 2, but all 3 of those. And by the way, India, the country in which we're sitting, is also on the outside of not 1, not 2, but all 3. So we're fragmented by pacts, but also we have different ideas about how the digital trading space ought to function, not least on things like cross-border data access and transfers and localization. But if fragmentation is a problem, as my colleague Rudra Chaudhry likes to remind me, fragmentation can also be an opportunity. And it is an opportunity no less for India. And that was a big theme yesterday on everything from India Stack to exporting and scaling digital ideas that have been pioneered here. Things like digital solutions for financial inclusion. India has a lot of solutions. And so that gets at this theme of opportunity. And last, as was mentioned, India is going to be the G20 president. And so that raises the question of what international coordination is going to look like. So I'm going to moderate this lightly, but I hope you can keep all of those in mind. And Christoph, I thought I would start with you. You're negotiating the India-EU FTA, a challenge to negotiate any FTA, but I know this one is particularly challenging, especially in the digital and data space. Talk a little bit about the challenges of fragmentation, but also how you're trying to overcome them in that context.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for your interest. I'll start by saying that obviously, while I'm sure you've heard, I couldn't attend, but I'm sure you've heard a lot about the opportunities that the digital revolution is bringing. I think it's fair to say that while digital trade is now the main driver of the, at least international trade, but to a large extent also of the world economy, it disrupts business models. It comes at the cost of, the business as usual way of handling domestic regulation, and it starts impeding on the way governments regulate a number of fundamental issues. We've just heard Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager speak about privacy, about competition in the digital sphere, and about online and offline level playing field, so to speak, or discrimination. Now, the way we should try and work together in a situation where all the actors are actively trying to regulate that sphere and advance towards ensuring a fair, human-centric, but also level field for competition in those areas is to cooperate with one another. Now, the European Union and India have recently embarked on a set of big endeavors. Mrs. Vestager just referred to the Trade and Technology Council, which Prime Minister Modi and President von der Leyen agreed to establish when they met in April, and we're finalizing the terms of reference of that instrument. That's going to be a very important tool for cooperating on everything going from digital governance, artificial intelligence, but also global trade challenges, screening of foreign direct investment in sensitive technologies, etc., etc. Now, on the sides of that important cooperation forum, we've also decided to resume our free trade negotiations, our investment negotiations, and we also have negotiations on geographical indications, but that's probably still a little bit less relevant for the digital world. But when it comes to the free trade agreement, which is a gigantic endeavor, as you've just mentioned, the chapter on digital trade is going to be absolutely key. There cannot be any modern trade agreement without a robust set of digital trade rules that touch upon, free transfer of data, prohibit data localization measures, that protect source code from mandatory disclosure, but that also make sure that consumer benefit from online protection just as much as they benefit, just as much as they're protected when they operate in the offline environment. So very much along the lines of what Mrs. Vestager said earlier, making sure that we do not distinguish between offline and online activities. Now, one of the points that you've just mentioned is the risk of further fragmentation that we see. You've mentioned a few agreements, and obviously, perhaps also because we're geographically a bit further away from those geographies, the European Union also happens to be a big actor that is outside of those. But we feel that it's extremely important to avoid a situation where trade agreement generate some sort of what was referred to in the past famously by an Indian professor at Columbia University, Mr. Bhagwati, the spaghetti bowl of trade agreements. That was at the time about rules of origin for trading goods. But obviously we should avoid a situation where a series of different digital trade rules established in mega free trade agreements disrupts business models and makes it more complicated for operators to deal across borders. Now, the way we would want to do this is obviously by unleashing the enormous potential that already a bilateral agreement between the European Union and India could have. I see a number of challenges there, that's for sure, and the latest data protection bill that's been issued still contains some localization requirements. These are not exactly things that are free trade friendly, so this is going to be something that we're going to look at. But the objective of our effort is going to be to try and come to see eye to eye on a whole series of issues that are relevant for digital trade. It doesn't necessarily have to always be about data flows, but the recognition of electronic contracts, making sure you can authenticate yourself electronically. I already mentioned consumer protection. A whole range of issues are going to be relevant in this context. The idea is to remove unjustified barriers to trade, but enhance the legal certainty that companies benefit from. That would be, of course, particularly important for small and medium-sized enterprise. I hear a lot of concerns linked to SMEs here in India. We happen to share that view in the European Union. Now, this being said, and I'll try and finish with this to be brief and leave enough space for the discussion afterwards. Beyond the bilateral liberalization that can be reached through a free trade agreement like the one we are trying to develop between the European Union and India, it's going to be important in this digital sphere that is probably the one where physical borders are less relevant. We always say that physical borders become less and less relevant for any trade. I was having lunch today with a big maritime transport operator, and obviously we see global supply chain becoming genuinely global, even for physical goods. But if there is one area where physical borders are irrelevant, this is the one you operate in, the digital trade sphere. And for that to happen, you need to develop global solutions. Bilateral solution, even at the scale of an EU-India deal, will not be enough. And so from that perspective, in the trade policy area, we have the World Trade Organization seated in Geneva, where negotiations on electronic commerce are actually taking place within a group of about 85 or 86 countries, I think now. The one big absent, or the elephant in the room, so to speak, is India, that has decided not to take part in those negotiations. And certainly we would, as Europeans, hope that India could join this global process, because at the end of the day, if we are to avoid fragmentation, we should try and go for multilateral solution. And in the world of trade, we see the WTO as the right place for doing this. Now, India's absence is surprising because of how prominent India is in the world of services trade, of digital services trade. We also hope that India is going to use its G20 presidency to advance a truly global agenda. As Europeans, we tend to be biased probably in favor of international cooperation because we are ourselves the product of international cooperation, so to speak. And so this is the best we wish for India's chairmanship of the G20. Thank you.
Thanks, Christophe. I have so many questions coming out of that, but I know, as I said, time is limited. Bhupen, I was going to go to you, but actually that last point on the G20 makes me think, I actually want to jump to Anita for a second, because Anita, India is taking over the G20 presidency. You do so much work with ASEAN, India. You have a perspective of third countries, fourth countries, fifth countries. I'm wondering if you could give us a take on what the countries that you're operating in and that you look at are looking for from technology trade regimes, but also what the opportunities might be for India to leverage its G20 presidency to, as Christophe was implying, and as we heard a lot about yesterday, drive some solutions to this problem of fragmentation.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so we are working in Southeast Asia and East Asia region, which of course by definition includes India also, because the East Asia Summit membership is our core area of work. So what we have seen here is that the way technology is looked at as a component of international trade, and this includes the services component of trade, is the analogy that is mostly being exercised here, or they would like to see, is similar to what they have done in the previous few decades in terms of trade facilitation. That is to say, a freer flow of goods, people, finances, and so on and so forth. So basically having very thin borders for trade, which is aided by technology. Now, typically, digital economy, which is based on the platforms of information and communication technology, AI, robotics, automation, typically these technologies aid consumption and production in any part of the world. So what this region, the developing Asia, but which is also the factory Asia, and which is very, very closely integrated in terms of trade, would like to believe that a similar analogy of trade facilitation may not apply in the digital economy part for two or three very crucial reasons. The first, of course, being that the digital divide is very stark in this part of the world. Countries which are still coping with their own industrial competitiveness are now confronted with the onslaught of the digital economy. Places of production and locations are also shifting as countries get vertically integrated in their own value chains. But more importantly, what we see is in terms of technology-aided trade, typically the third unbundling, where the work allocation can be distributed in several parts of the world, is that it defies the gravity model of trading, which is normally used in the regional value chains, where countries trade with countries geographically closer to each other. So that is why a digital economy is creating some element of dilemma, a large element of dilemma, I would say, in this part of the world. And which is why the regulatory frameworks that we are seeing here in process, evolving in several countries, including India, have a large proprietary elements in their frameworks. But if you will recall the Japan G20 presidency, the free flow of data with trust. Now, typically, technology in trade is discussed in the Trade and Investment Working Group in G20. But free flow of data with trust is based on an analogy of equal partnership, that is to say, only among the G20 member countries. I would reckon, from the way I have seen India preparing for its G20 presidency so far, is that India would like to bring the developmental aspects in almost every track to the fore. As you know, although G20 does put a great emphasis on developmental aspects, but still, because the whole construct of G20 was such that the conversation never really reached the developmental shores in a great traction. So India would like to bring that to the forefront and create some sort of a cooperative mechanism here. Some success has already been achieved in terms of taxation last time, but the year before last, I mean to say, but that still remains a work in progress. So presumably, and we are supporting India on this in the Trade and Investment Working Group, to create a more developmental conversation, which is not just localized to the G20 members, but are usable by members outside the G20 also equally. So that's where I see the whole contestability of the technology in trade, digital technology in particular, which is right up front for us, and which is also a cause of dilemma for the countries in this region, who were very competitive as far as merchandise trade was concerned. But the moment the technology-aided trade comes in, there are several areas of concern which should likely be addressed in the India's presidency. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Anita. You know, it's so striking that you mentioned the Osaka initiative in the context of the G20, because, of course, the current G20 president, Indonesia, was one of the countries that refused to sign up to it. And the next G20 president, India, also refused to sign up to it. So notably, the last time there was a big effort on cross-border data, as you said, Prime Minister Abe's free flow of data with trust, those two countries were not part of it. So we'll see if India is more successful in trying to leverage this. We all hope so. Bhupen, I want to turn to you, because there are a lot of interesting characteristics of technology trade where companies like Amazon are really on the front lines. Of course, e-commerce, it's not exactly like retail trade, but I know you're pioneering a lot of solutions here in India that can be that are unique, but also can be exported and scaled and be models elsewhere. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Happy to talk about it. Evan, I work as part of the global trade team in Amazon. And our group is essentially looking at cross-border e-commerce, right? And so when typically people talk about global trade, it is often just business-to-business transactions. But what we are seeing on the ground is just tremendous entrepreneurial energy within seller-based, manufacturer-based, at the MSME level, to be part of this cross-border trade, right? And so a big part of the G20 focus area could be digital empowerment of MSME. I know that is a part of a large topic area already, but how do you sort of make technology infrastructure so that MSMEs can participate in global trade and it's not just a select large few businesses? And what we are seeing now in the last 2-3 years is a good example of how things are already moving in that direction. So just to give you an example, the recently concluded Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale, almost 1 lakh Indian sellers actually contributed into creating deals for American consumers on Amazon.com, and same in the UK and EU. This revolution is just getting started. I would love for that number to actually become 10x from here, where 1 million MSMEs can actually be part of the cross-border trade. Because once the trade ties go to that level of deep-rootedness, I think there is enough motivation for all the participants to stay together, right? The moment it is saying it is loosely bound or only the top select few, it's very easy to say we can figure out alternatives and so on. I would just, maybe the whole objective of G20 would be digital empowerment of MSMEs in India. I know that's a huge initiative for the government here, and I would love to just sort of hear from the panel how they see that as India takes up the G20.
Do you feel like there's something unique about enterprises of that size that presents particular challenges?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is people are just wary about several different aspects about cross-border trade, right? So if you just look at, if I am a Ayurveda a face mask manufacturer in India, and I want to list my product all over the country, there are a few things that technology has already solved for. For example, you can create a listing in English, and there are enough ML model tools that will translate it, and that listing can be available in German, in French, in Japanese, and all over the world. There are companies like Amazon, and there are others who sort of just helping out on the cross-border logistics front, right? There are companies that we partner with that are helping on cross-border payments front. But I think in general, the fear right now, not the fear, there is sort of an anxiety as to what are the compliance requirements, what are the product specifications, what are the FDA regulations, right? So we notice that an inordinate amount of time is spent in just explaining to MSMEs that, hey, this is not that complicated, and a lot of this is digitized already, right? So if I'm an organic tea manufacturer or seller from India, what is the definition of organic? And maybe Europe has one definition, Japan has one definition. Can we sort of create an infrastructure where that is common, and businesses can then just say, hey, here's a specification as long as you're dealing with this category. And the smallest business can then participate in cross-border trade. I think that's something that we can really aspire to. I would love to hear the panel's view on that.
Thanks. That's actually a good segue to Sarah, because I know you're working on a lot of things like skilling, and so I'd be curious. How should we think about models that work, models that you've tried, or models that you project could be most successful at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be on the panel and to meet everybody here. My name's Sarah Fallon. I'm Regional Director of Science and Innovation and Tech, based in the British High Commission here in New Delhi. And so I think I've got the best job in the world because I'm here at a point where tech is completely crucial to growth, and some of the partnerships that we're building are incredibly exciting. I think talking about fragmentation and bringing it back to your original point, Evan, I think it's helpful. So I think one of the great opportunities is that there are endless things that we can do on tech between the UK and India. The opportunities are staggering and they're growing day by day, especially if we're looking at the emerging technology domain. So I think firstly, the thing is not to be afraid of that. and to work with that flux and ambiguity. And I think often it's helpful to look at things as systems problems. So green hydrogen, or any kind of colour of hydrogen, is a hot topic at the moment. So it's cutting it down and looking at it as a systems problem, and what we can do, working with the two countries together, bringing our finest minds together, and seeing it in the context of a grand challenge. What's our big dream? What do we want to do, and where do we want to be, and how do we want to work together on this specific, tangible solution? And I think that's really helped us forge the partnerships that we have over the years. I'm just going to major a bit on success stories as well, and just building on what Bhupen's just said. We have a plant science partnership between TDU in Bangalore and Kew Gardens. And anyone that's been to London, I'm sure you visited Kew Gardens, and it's a beautiful place in southwest London. And this is a really good example of how you can use data to boost trade. We have many plant names within the volumes of Kew Garden. They have lots of different archives that they're working through at the moment and digitising. And on the TDU side, they have databases full of the same plants, but they have different names. And so at the moment, the two sides are working together to streamline the names of those two sides. They've got to about 10,000 at this point, and then that will mean that there's an enabling framework there for the two sides to start trading medicinal plants, raising the standards, and so on. So I think that's like a really interesting example. We talked a lot about enabling frameworks in different ways. Anita's talked about the G20 and the role of ASEAN there. We've got the Roadmap 2030. And for those of you who are uninitiated, I obsess about this every day. This is kind of our guiding set of principles for the UK-India relationship. But our two prime ministers agreed this roadmap just over 2 years ago. And it gives us a what and a how. So it's what we're going to do, the high-level mandate for UK-India tech partnership, a medium-term vision. And like I said, it's really important to have those tangible goals in sight, so then we can work towards that in the short and the medium term. We're negotiating an FTA, just like Christoph's talked about. This is a really interesting, exciting time to be doing that. Talking about, just majoring a little bit on what Anita talked about in terms of inclusivity. This is also really important. Anita and I are busting a manel today. There would have been a man in my place, so it would have been slightly skewed, but now we've got that even representation. But joking apart, it's important to bake in inclusivity into all of the tech partnerships and the growth opportunities that we are building at the moment. Diversity is a no-brainer. I don't need to sit here and tell anyone that that's really important in the domain of science and tech. Of course, that's going to be a massive, important strand of growth. But it's also thinking creatively in the context of my job. How can we get the regions involved? We speak to the central governments a lot. Government of India partnerships are very dynamic, but how can we get the state government interaction there as well? And also from the UK perspective, bringing in what we call a four nations approach is very important as well, looking at all corners of the UK. Moving on to regulation and standards, this is something that I've heard pop up over the course of the last 24 hours. And I think that's going to be major in terms of figuring out who are we building the standards with. Is it going to be country to country? Is it smaller groups? Or is it a larger multilateral effort? And I think all of those can come into play, but as respective countries, we need to think about what works on a case-by-case basis. To give an example of this, the Prime Minister's launched the UK-Indian Hydrogen Hub. So it's a science and innovation-based partnership launched in Easter time of this year. And we thought it was incredibly important to embed a standards and IP track into this hydrogen partnership. So that's UK Intellectual Property Organisation and the British Standards Institute are speaking to their Indian counterparts about what in an ideal world would seamless tech transfer look like in the domain of hydrogen. And that's like a really exciting and nascent area to explore. So that's ongoing. So if anyone's interested in that, you can come and speak to me after the break. Last but not least, we've got COP and G20. I think these are incredibly important frameworks. It goes without saying to give us a clear signal of the importance of something like clean growth. And when I think about clean growth, I think about digitalization and data flow within industry. And we've touched on this already a little bit. We talk about automation, but this is a little bit of a red herring. I think that we need to think in a much more longer term context, the skills that we will truly require in the fourth industrial revolution and how we're equipping the next generation with those skills. Stuff like digital twins. We're not going to have traditional factories. We're going to be using AR, VR. We're going to be pressing buttons that are virtual, and something in the real world is going to be happening. There's a digital twin centre just being launched in Northern Ireland at the moment, and I very much hope that we can forge partnerships in that domain with Indian counterparts in due course. And I think also something around the just-in-case reference that Minister Jaishankar mentioned yesterday is truly important as well. We've just come out of the pandemic. It's massively disrupted business, trade, free flow of people, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the stuff that we're looking at in terms of pandemic preparedness, I really think plays into this space. Looking at the just-in-case scenarios. We've had the Covishield moment. We've manufactured, through the AstraZeneca-Oxford Serum partnership, over 2 billion vaccines. So that's equipped us with getting the pandemic under control, along with lots of other international efforts. But that's a really good example of tech transfer for global good. I mean, I can't think of a better one in my career. And that's led us on to, it's branched out into other things like the UK-India One Health Hub, looking at pandemic preparedness in the context of the G20, and also antimicrobial resistance, which we regard as a slow pandemic. So it's kind of looking at future-proofing through all the tech partnerships that we're forging at the moment. I think I'm going to leave it there, Evan, but in terms of the bilateral engagement, there's so much that we can learn from India and vice versa, and we have so much verve and enthusiasm, both within the High Commission but also in the wider echelons of our government ministries. We're ready to take the partnership to the next level. So I think either in the physical or the virtual realm, we'll be doing that very enthusiastically in the years to come. So I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so the clock is ticking, 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 and I want to give the audience a shot at you. So if you do have a question, please do line up. But sorry, Christoph, I do want to ask you one thing, because I think, I hope you won't find me cheeky with this, but I think there's going to be a lot of interest in what the dynamics of the FTA negotiation with India are going to look like. So I'm American. I'm old enough to remember when the United States also negotiated FTAs and bilateral investment treaties and so on. And I remember when the US and India were doing a bilateral investment treaty, one of the challenges was that the United States was very rigidly wedded to a model BIT. And there was very little flexibility for the United States off the model BIT. So when the US encountered a BIT negotiation with India, much less with China, which it's hard to recall this back in the Jurassic era, the US was also trying to negotiate a BIT. That lack of flexibility was a challenge. So I'm wondering, give us a sense of how you're likely to approach it, where you are inclined or able to be flexible, given what you said. And it was kind of a throwaway at the end of your remarks about this trio of this set of bills in India, the localization emphasis here. How are you going to approach that question of rigidity and flexibility?
Well, that's probably the center challenge, and that's going to be relevant not just for digital trade, but for the negotiations across the board. The European Union is a little bit like a super tanker. When it tries to move, it's a little bit like when the Evergreen was blocked in the middle of the Suez Canal. So sometimes it's not a very good idea to make us move. But we tend to approach, unfortunately, I should say, because of our structure with 27 member states that all have very diverse interests, we tend to approach negotiations a bit rigidly with some sort of a standard menu. It's not an all-you-can-eat menu, it's the all-you-must-eat menu, and you start with, you have the starters, the main course, the desserts, and you have to eat everything. And that's obviously going to be very tricky for India to swallow, so to speak, just like India approaches the negotiations also with a very peculiar viewpoint. They have their own FTA tradition that is very far apart from the one that we come from. So at some stage, I think the political level will need to step in, force the difficult compromises on people like me who tend to be a bit stubborn in defending their traditional position. However, just to be very clear, these negotiations started in June. We've had 2 rounds where in the first round the EU presented its views. In the second one, India presented its own positions. And we're now embarking on that journey where hopefully we're going to try and bridge some divergences. But a lot of technical work needs to be done before the political level can usefully step in. So that's why the agenda is very busy.
And you'll be very busy. All right, I'm going to turn to the audience. Keep it brief, but also tell us who you are so we know who you are.
Yeah, sure. Am I audible? Yeah. So, good afternoon, all and one present here. My name is Mayank Gupta. I am a young global ambassador, and I'm from Kautilya School of Public Policy, which is based out of Hyderabad. My question to you is that we have seen that Europe has been at the forefront when it comes to climate action. How do you see EU and India free trade agreement create better opportunities pertaining to climate-related tech and exchange of mutually beneficial knowledge?
So I assume you're asking Christophe this question. Yeah, why don't we, okay, thank you, good idea. Let's take another one. Tell us who you are.
Is it on? Okay, yeah, sorry. So I'm a GTS Young Ambassador from IIITB. My name is Rijul Sarchdev. So my question was also directed to Christophe, sir. So I'm into privacy. So we've all heard about the EU GDPR, and it's considered, well, the gold and maybe now silver standard of privacy. But it respects the rights of the citizens in the EU. But what happens if we invert the question? So, for example, if we are looking at a country like India, which doesn't even have a privacy protection bill in place right now, or any legislation on privacy which has been passed by Parliament, would it be applicable for trade to be allowed between these two countries, or would the EU simply disallow that? And do you think the EU should change its stance maybe and become a little more malleable in the future?
Great, we got it. I'm going to take the one last question. We're going to put it on the table. Hopefully it's not to Christophe, since he's got two of the questions already. And then we'll just go through.
Great, thanks. Josh White. I'm at Johns Hopkins University and at Brookings. This is a question for Bhupen. We've heard a lot about digital public goods and about the sort of country-specific models for those goods, and a little bit about the prospects of interoperability among these different models. You know, from where you sit, where would you like to see more interoperability as these systems are being built? You know, is it in identities? Is it in payments and health? What would that look like in a way that would be useful for what you're doing? Thanks.
Good question. Thanks. All right, I'm going to start with Bhupen, then I'm going to go to Christophe, and then Sarah, I'll give you the last word if you want to add anything else. Oh, and Anita, sorry. And Anita as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you posed the question the way you posed it, and there's actually tremendous parallels that we can draw as to why digital identities became so important and so critical, and what does that translate into a business world or a trade world, right? So, for example, first is just who you are and the trust and that you get from it. The transparency of communication and digital transaction base that can happen. And third is just transparency of information and payments and that type of stuff, right? All of them find actually applications in global trade, obviously, without a doubt, right? I think the whole point is, can you make it so friction-free that if I am a small seller in Delhi, in Khan Market, who's about to launch a store on Amazon or eBay or wherever it is, that I can be instantly recognized by all consumers all over the world. And you know that this is authentic because this person owns this particular brand and it's driving this type of good, right? So if that's the vision that we go to, I see tremendous applicability of that same sort of mental model into the business stack. We are actually starting to see some of these things coming, right? Like blockchain in terms of how we understand, connectivity on the payments front, etc. There are a lot of technology tools that are being built. The question is, can we get all of them integrated in a cross-border e-commerce sense and not just stay localized to each individual countries? Because if you enable cross-border e-commerce, that's the most grassroots level integration that's possible between economies. And I think that's the opportunity that's in front of us. So I'm actually, thank you for posing the question that way. I think that's really the challenge for technology providers like Amazon and others in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's great. Great question, great answer. Christoph, you had two questions directly.
Thanks a lot. And I think they're linked. The first thing I should say is that in our view, the GDPR is certainly the gold standard, as it is not any kind of silver or bronze standard. But more seriously, it allows me to link to the first question, because while we think that this is a gold standard, if we were able to cooperate with India and agree on a series of principles on digital trade more broadly, but the question of data flow is obviously central in this matter. If we were able to convince India of the value of protecting privacy, which in both of our systems is a fundamental right. I understand the Indian Constitutional Court declared privacy a fundamental right, just like it is in the European Union. Now, I'm more of a trade guy, so I'm more an expert in the liberalization part of things there. And I think it's absolutely important for India to realize that, for example, the issue of data localization requirements has nothing to do with the protection of privacy. And so if we could jointly develop standards for the protection of privacy that would, for example, do away with any kind of localization requirements, we would jointly potentially develop a diamond standard so that we keep some sort of a hierarchy even above gold, and that would be part of some sort of a contribution to the international efforts, a little bit like the gentleman was saying earlier. We're at the forefront of environmental protection measures as well in the EU. But if India and the EU could join their forces to advance digital regulation in a non-discriminatory way, it would be beneficial to the whole world. Thank you.
That's an encouraging message, and I'm going to borrow that metaphor. I know we're at time. It's flashing red, but I do, just before we stop. Anita, Sarah, if there's anything that you want to add, just take 15, 20 seconds and please
Over
do so.
to you, Anita, first, and then
Okay,
we can round
Anita?
off.
Okay, thank you. Yes, two things I would like to emphasize, and it is this. In terms of trade, and since I'm a trade person also, I would like to emphasize that market forces always allow trade, whether it is merchandise or it is of a digital economy kind, e-commerce. Market forces allow some kind of stabilization, balancing, as long as they are backed up by adequate cooperation among the governments on the border and across the border. So which is why then regulatory cooperation becomes very, very important for preventing technology to become politicized and become even to some extent weaponized in international trade. I would like to give a very small example here is the US-China trade tensions and why it has not affected the suppliers in Southeast Asia and East Asia adversely is precisely because both the countries have refused to apply any kind of non-traditional, or I should say trade discriminatory policy against suppliers from this region. So that alone shows that tensions apart, markets still perform. And I would like to end by returning back to the issue of inclusivity. Employment and growth is still a very, very serious concern in all the parts of developing Asia, Africa. It is even in developed world. So therefore, this generation of technology, which has far invaded the commerce aspect, it requires some element of equity, if not equality, and which is why efforts of governments coming together and which is why platforms like G20 then become very important, despite several individual differences that we see and talk about.
Thanks. All right, Sarah, super fast. Last word to you.
In a nutshell, I'm really happy that you talked about health because that's something dear to my heart. And the UK-India Digital Health Partnership at the moment is looking at how we optimize data flows how we use AI and telemedicine to enable a really healthy and prosperous fourth industrial revolution. So just to close on that, I think you can't do anything that we've talked about unless you have a healthy population. And so I think that's one of the areas of focus for us, is to really optimize that and throw all the tech that we can at this. So thank you.
Great. Team, fabulous. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel.